Assalamualaikum everyone, my name's Monique Tui. This is another episode of Be Well, where we interview a variety of experts in the area of mental health and community work. Um, this is an initiative for the Centre for Muslim Wellbeing and it's conducted on the lands of the Wurundjeri. So let me start by paying my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. In this episode, we're going to be talking with Dr. Nora Amath. And Dr. Nora Amath is a multi-award winning community developer, which I actually really like that term, and we'll explore that a little bit later. I think that means really busy for a few decades of your life in the space of community, but community development is a much quicker way to say that. She's a sociologist who researches on multiculturalism, social inclusion, diversity, leadership, and community development. Nora is a newly appointed Executive Director of the Islamophobia Register Australia, an Adjunct Research Fellow at Griffin University, and an Australian Fellow at the Centre for Women, Faith and Leadership at the Institute for Global Engagement in Washington, DC. That sounds fascinating. She's the Director of Yara, hope I'm saying that properly, Nora. We'll talk about that, a not-for-profit organisation focused on enhancing women's wellbeing. And she's a non-executive director of Islamic Relief Australia, just to add in another organisation. And I could actually list a few more, but the list is long in terms of Nora's involvement in community. And in 2024, Nora was included in the UN's Building a Better World, the Women Leading Religions for Peace Global Directory. Well, that's an achievement. So welcome, Nora. Welcome to this episode of Be Well. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, tell me about community developer. Is that like the abbreviated way of just saying really active in the community space for a really long time?
It is. Can I just also begin by saying Assalamu alaikum, Monique,
Absolutely.
and to everyone out there. And I also want to do acknowledgement of country. I am zooming in from Yagur and Turbo Land in Mianjin, or otherwise known as Brisbane. What does a community developer does? It basically means seeking responses and solutions to perhaps problems within community, to be able to provide the resources so that community has access to some of these very important resources, and to be able to build a community where everybody feels like they belong, where everybody
Yeah.
has a place, to make their own, where everybody can count on each other and feels
Mm,
responsible for each other. So that's basically what it means. It means that I'm just deeply embedded, love community, embedded in
mm.
community, work within community, and the community is my family, really.
I love that idea. And you know,
Yeah,
in it can be strange to many Muslims in particular that I think globally have fairly strong senses and of connection to the idea community, but sometimes people do not. So sometimes outside of our communities, people actually, well, I've heard them ask, "What do you mean when you reference your community? What are you actually talking about?" Which is really interesting to think about how people exist in a world without the support of a collectivist
yeah,
community.
yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, if I can provide a story, really, I know we're getting straight into it right now,
excellent.
but I really want to provide a story where I realize the importance of community. Now, I grew up really, and we can talk about that in a little second, but I grew up um, really being outside of community for so long because of who I am, where I was born into, the ethnic group that I was born into. I was always an outsider looking to find my place within community. And it took, this sounds really awful and really strange, but there's always a silver lining to everything. That's just who I am. I'm quite an optimist, looking for what is the lesson here. And for me, 9/11, as horrific and as tragic as those incidents are, um, that is when I felt community.
Mm,
For one of the very first times in my life, that was where I felt community, because everybody remembers where they were on 9/11.
mm,
Um, and it's a story that I share quite often, and it's really what got me doing the work that I do. And I call it the fence
mm,
story because it is about a fence. So my husband and I had we were at, I think this was probably April 2001, so about 5 months just before September 11th,
Mm,
2001. And we had bought a block of land, and we had built our house, quite excited. We had two young children at that time, a young couple with two children. We bought our house, and we were visiting our block of land. Every single day we'd see the concrete laid, and the building sort of go up, and the bricks and the roof, etc. And April 2001, the completion of our house, where the neighbors and my husband and I were visiting our house, and we were going to have a conversation about the fences, because that's what you normally do. You
that's
build a
right.
brand new house, and you want to protect it. You want to protect your space. You want to secure your space. You want to say, this is my house, right? My land, and
Right.
nobody else can sort of trespass into it. So it was really, the fence becomes like a marker of the boundary, whether we like it
That's
or
right.
not.
That's right.
And I remember one afternoon, we picked up the kids from school. We went to visit the block of land. We had a prearranged meeting with our neighbors, and um the men went and got out their tape measure, and were measuring the fencing line, and the retaining walls, et cetera. The mums and I were just sort of chatting, and looking over and watching our kids play. And Cheryl, my neighbor at that time, said, wouldn't it be great if we didn't build any fences, if we just allowed our children to play?
Yeah.
And we're watching the children play, from jumping from yard to yard. And I thought, it's not a great idea. And so
Mm,
we called our husbands over, and we actually said to our husbands, hey, Cheryl had a great idea. Why don't we just leave the fences? Let's just leave the fences, and almost build a very intentional community.
community. Mhm.
And that was April 2001. And it's exactly what the husbands are
Mm.
great. We can, the loan money is get depleting as we speak towards the end of a build. That means that, we can get better furniture, whatever it is. It like, everyone was in agreement. This is a great idea. Let's do this. And so we built an intentional community with no fences. We all moved in. It just meant that, my neighbors, we had a deep sense of responsibility for one another.
Yeah.
Yes, we didn't have the borders up, but then if we saw, like, if my neighbor saw that there wasn't washing on the line, something's wrong. Nora's got two young kids. She's got to have washing on the line every single day, for
Yeah.
instance, or, et cetera, et cetera. So there was just this deep sense of care, compassion, and
Mm,
responsibility for one another. And that was April 2001. Skip forward to September 11th, 2001, and my husband and I were getting ready to go to work. We turn on the morning news, as we do, to catch it just before our drive to the university to teach. And I remember just the towers, and the towers. Those
mm.
images will be forever seared in my memory. And I remember calling my husband over, and I said, "Honey, you've got to see what I'm seeing." And immediately, this deep sense of dread, the
Mm.
horror that we're seeing, yes, but also the dread of what it means now to be the other again,
Yeah.
the other, because that was the conversation then. It was an us and them. It was this binary, it was this dichotomy of, you're either with us or you're not with us, you're part of the whole axis of evil. But my thinking then was, oh gosh, the fences are going to go up. That was my
Mm.
immediate reaction. I didn't think that, 5 months of friendship, and however, and the connections were deep with my neighbors. I
Yeah.
just didn't know if that was able to withstand the horror that we're seeing. But in fact, the fences never went up. And I waited,
Mm.
a couple weeks to say, okay, once the shock, dies down, the neighbors are, they don't want to appear to be bigots, because they're not.
Yeah.
But they were having to answer and respond to concerns from, their colleagues at work, or their family, going, you're, living right next to Muslim neighbors, and devout Muslim neighbors at that.
Yeah.
And they knew how
Yeah.
devout we were. And yet the fences never went up. I said, okay, give it a few weeks. No, fences never went up. Okay, when the shock dies down, and they realize that every afternoon around 5 o'clock, we call our son in from whatever neighbor's house that he's, playing at,
Yeah.
and his name is Osama. So every afternoon,
Mm.
Osama time to come home now. So we're devout Muslims, and our eldest son's name is Osama, who was born in 98, by the way, so well
Yeah.
before,
Well, before any
9/11.
other famous Osama. Yep.
So, yeah, so but the fences never went up until we moved out, and, our
Mm,
house was bought by an investor, and they weren't sure who was gonna be coming in and out because it was an investment property. But that gave me such a deep sense of community, and I thought, "This
mm,
is what I want to do." I wanna
yeah.
share the story of what it means to intentionally build a community where people feel safe,
Mm,
where people feel loved, where people felt cared for, and it was because of this human connection that we have to one another and this deep sense of responsibility and care. So this is where I am, 20, 20
yeah.
something years later.
And Nora, thank you so much for sharing that story. And I think that beautifully articulates the term for you being a community developer and
Yeah.
of the idea that community building is very deliberate. Of course, sometimes it's accidental and incidental,
Mm.
but at times it has to be very
It
intentional.
has to be.
And you
Yeah,
know
it
what?
has to be.
Outside the square thinking. And
Yeah,
just
yeah,
to share a slight adjunct, as you're telling that story, I have friends who in Melbourne who did exactly the same thing. And I was so they shared backyards, 3 houses in a row,
yeah,
like sharing backyards, no fences, and being brought into that for things like Eid and other sort
yeah,
of familial gatherings,
yeah,
and immediately I can very deeply understand and resonate with that idea
yeah,
of what it is to have a community barbecue in your backyard where there's
yeah,
50 people and it's 3
yeah,
households, their families and
yeah,
friends
yeah,
coming and joining in for
yeah,
weddings in the backyard or Eid in the backyard or big jumping castles in the backyard for kids and that's exactly what it was. And just for me to even just be an
yeah,
outsider for those families that live like that, but to be brought into that, it just gives you a very different way around deliberate living and
yeah,
of creating not just the sense of community, but also that a really very deep friendship with people.
yeah,
So you're right.
mm,
Even psychologically, Nora, we have to pull down walls, to open
yeah,
up to people. And for some people, that there's a big vulnerability in that. And
yeah,
when, unfortunately, the dynamic and the context, the social political context at that time, and unfortunately, not much has changed. Um,
mm,
we have to be very deliberate about that because it's very easy
mm,
for walls of fear and anger to disrupt our connectedness to other people. And that brings me into some questions which I've brought you along
yeah,
today to answer.
yeah,
I can see I don't even have to ask the first one. I know why you're passionate about this. You pretty much shared that through your fence
mm,
story. It's
mm,
obviously very deeply meaning for you
mm,
to community building and to be involved in the community more broadly. And I know you're absolutely a type of person that can see needs, and where there's a need, someone's got to be the
yeah,
solution to that, and you
yeah,
just go, well, that's me,
yeah.
and let me find other people who are
That's
just like
that's
me.
basically, yeah, that's basically it. The number of
That's right.
organizations I
That's right.
started because I've waited for somebody to do something about it, and in the end, I just grab a bunch of girlfriends. We meet for a coffee and say, "Okay, what are we going to do about this? This is
Exactly.
how we roll."
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Um, the never-ending needs of the community, because when you can see the needs, even just the perception of all the different types of community needs around us, particularly in a sort of a young and emerging Muslim community, even though we've been here for a very long time, but I still feel like in many ways we're young, youthful, and emerging. And so when there are so many needs, which
mhm,
if you take responsibility and you see yourself as one of those people that can solve some of
mm,
those needs or be a solution, it can be exhausting. So what sustains you? Because you've been in this space now for over 2 decades.
mm, mm. Um, a lot of things sustain me. A few years ago, and this look, humor sustains me quite a bit. So probably in response to this, and I'll be like brutally honest, what used to sustain me after hard, days work in community and work, because it wasn't just a 9 to 5 job, then it was community, after. So the countless community meetings that you have to have if there's a crisis, or if there isn't a crisis. So it's just that constant, almost 12-hour days. And what used to sustain me was My love for pistachios and kombucha. So that was what sustained me. So I found humor, and just being able to sit there with pistachios and kombucha. But honestly, right now, I'm really finding myself chasing waterfalls on weekends, like
Mm,
going somewhere near water. And I never understood why. And I say this to people, find what it is that you naturally gravitate towards. And I always gravitated towards water and
yeah.
never really understanding why. So whether it is waterfalls or the beach or a hike, along a creek, as long as there
Mm,
was some body of water, that
yeah.
was what really grounded me.
Mhm.
And it was only probably about 8 years ago when my mother revealed to me that I was actually born on a boat. I didn't know that. And
There
so
you go.
that is that where my sense of what it means to, yeah, to feel balanced, to get a sense of equilibrium when things are just, I've had a few major challenges, health wise in my life as well. And that was the thing that got me through, was to find ways in which I grounded myself in some sort of water-based activity, because it was what I needed, because it is exhausting.
Mhm.
You are playing working within community. Obviously there are many actors involved, so not just the community members, but the community leadership, but then you have external forces that, entities, like, rather than forces, external forces that you're also having to navigate, in the different personalities, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really important for me to say, this is it. I have to find time in which I get out into nature and find myself, just being at one with nature. So it was just that um that journeying and understanding what it is that my body needs is the self-care that, yeah, that I have given myself over the years.
Beautiful. I mean, there's at least 5 different evidence-based strategies
Yeah.
in that answer. I love it. I
Yeah.
love it. So thank you for sharing. Um, you have just recently been appointed, there's probably been a little bit of time now, as the Executive Director of Islamophobia Register Australia. Can you tell me and tell us about the main goals of IRA?
Yeah. So the Islamophobia Register Australia, or we call ourselves just a register, it's been around for about 10 years, and we're really the first of its kind to have a very comprehensive service for our victim survivors. And the core of our work is probably embedded in three terms, or three concepts, I should say: respect, dignity, and security. That's what, and really the register aims to provide a platform for reporting of incidents recorded to be analyzed into a report, because we need to understand, what the issue is. But really our ultimate vision, and we just came up, we just had a board strategy day a few weeks ago, and the mission's still the same. Our vision's still the same. What we ultimately want is an inclusive and just Australian society. And in order to do that, we want to, lead the national efforts in tracking. So tracking is very important, reporting
Yeah.
and addressing Islamophobia through evidence base. So we don't want anecdotal evidence, because we all have anecdotal evidence, but we really need to know what the data is showing us. And then in order to also advocate, to use the evidence to be able to advocate, to publish the report so that it can be part of the national discourse. We don't want it just within the Muslim community. We want to talk about it within, other communities, outside of our communities, within governments, within, decision makers. And so in order to really drive the reform, education, and advocacy that we need in order to have an inclusive and just Australian society.
Wonderful. God, there's so much happening in the world right
I
now that's
know, I
influencing
know.
people and communities really globally to feel both angry and fearful. And both of those emotions are disruptors of connectedness, and particularly intercultural connectedness. I was just wondering if we can start, by talking about the impact of the war on Gaza and the genocide against Palestinians, and how has that had, sort of in what ways has that had an impact on Muslim experiences of Islamophobia in Australia?
Yeah, unfortunately, the impact has been massive, Monique. I can't even Eh, yeah, it's really an understatement to even use the word massive.
Yeah,
It's been massive in every single way of grief, of anger, of even hopelessness at times, and helplessness,
yeah,
of having genocide just played out on our screens 24 hours. I can't remember any single time. I know with the Vietnam War, which where I was born in Vietnam, I know that the impact of that short snippets of the Vietnam War being played out had an impact on those who were not, part of the war.
yeah,
And we're seeing this amplified, a million times over with our social media, with access to news 24 hours. So it's constantly, in front
yeah.
of us. So that itself internally, what's happening to the Muslim community and Muslim individually and collectively is that all those, the anger, the pain, the grief, the sense of the injustice, and yet trying to do what we possibly can, with, as we know as Muslims, we call it out, we do something about it, or we
Mm,
feel it. So that's internally what's happening to the individual and the collective. But what we're seeing on the ground in terms of Islamophobia, that I think in the first few weeks after the 7th of October, we saw a massive surge in reported incidents. And it was just, I think in the first few weeks, it jumped to about 1,300%. Just a couple of weeks after that. Now, 300, days post September, post 7th of October, we're averaging about a 600. We're still averaging about a 600 percent increase. And what we're seeing is also non-Muslims being impacted by this. So non-Muslims who, because Islamophobia is just a marker of, a marker of Muslimness, or as so it could be, anyone that may be identified as a Muslim, for instance,
yeah,
simply for wearing the keffiyeh. Be all of a sudden, wearing keffiyeh makes somebody, a mark of what it means to be a Muslim. So we've had,
right.
assaults on people wearing keffiyehs, or just a Palestinian pin, as we saw with
Mm,
many people. The incidents of Rita, the Greek women in Melbourne, having the swastika, on her driveway.
yeah.
Asala, at the rallies, we had the 6 young people in Adelaide wearing keffiyehs and punched and called horrific
Mm,
names. Again, just wearing the keffiyehs. So what we're seeing after the 7th of October is a massive, surge in incidents, but we're also seeing that the violence is quite sorry, the assaults are becoming more violent, and it's not necessarily just, one on one. It's not just in a public, but it can be a group of people who are getting assaulted at the same time. So we're
yeah.
seeing these trends that are very very worrying for us and concerning.
It is. It certainly seems like I think, for both of us having gone through the period and the post period of September 11 and
Mhm.
subsequent and other types of global
Yeah,
incidents, that the type of Islamophobia is um, not just increasing, but it's getting worse. It's getting more
yeah,
intense. So once upon a time, it might have been the, some name calling or
yeah,
exclusion or some hand gestures,
yeah,
or like a few words here and there,
yeah,
but it was fairly measured still. And to
yeah,
see this rise, where there's just almost no holds bar, like almost if there's
yeah,
this emerging community entitlement to be revolting, and violent
yeah,
towards other people who are passerbys or who are neighbours or
yeah.
who are, other parents within schools or, in sort of in those more public
Mm.
spaces is
And
really,
it's
really concerning.
yeah. And it's very gendered as well, Monique. So this is something that I know we've seen it, recently that it's 80% of victims are women,
Women. Yeah,
and the majority are perpetrators are men still.
yeah,
So it's still very much a gendered issue. So there are a lot of parallels there when we talk about violence against women, which was another space that I worked for the last 20 years.
yeah.
And so, yeah, so violence against women within the domestic, family violence space, but then within the Islamophobia and racism space, it's also, violence against women as well. So this is the sense of entitlement and the sense of power
Mm.
is what's at play within these two different forms of violence and very similar forms of violence as well.
Absolutely,
I
absolutely.
know that's
I'm
another
just thinking,
conversation.
oh, yeah, yeah, I mean, you're taking me back into memories, right?
Yeah,
There's just so much,
yeah,
and I think you can't,
yeah,
you have, I think as anyone being, born in at least the last
yeah,
50 years in Australia,
yeah.
has actually all grown up in different contexts where Islamophobia has been very present.
Mm,
And I feel like, having been Muslim for 30 years, and you too,
mm,
growing up in really formative, like our entire adulthood, basically, and obviously for the generations after us, it's their entire childhood, where been this amplification and politicization of Islamophobia. And this is the thing that gets me about, it's not like people in parliament, for example, don't know how influential their attitudes are. And if their attitudes and or policies are Islamophobic in nature, it is sending a very strong message down from the top
yeah,
down
yeah,
around what's okay,
yeah,
what's essentially permissible.
yeah,
Even if it sounds at times hypocritical, because there's laws and
yeah,
there's the Human Rights Commission, and we should be a civil society, and other types of messages, and we should be espousing Australian values like
mm,
mateship and
mm.
inclusion and equality, etc.
And give everyone a fair go.
Right.
Give everyone a fair go.
Do you know, interestingly, the word fair can't be equally translated in any other language except English?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you
Interesting.
for
So
sharing
it's
that.
not highly
Yeah.
equitable to use the word fair. It's not easily
Mm,
understood in other language groups.
mm,
Interesting. Side point.
mm,
Okay.
mm, mm, mm,
There are clearly some really big questions that Islamophobia
mm,
Register are grappling with to counter, as you try to record
mm,
and
mm,
encourage people to record, and
mm,
overcoming this cynicism of, well, what will it do if I
mm,
make a report? If I go to the website, or if I make the phone call
mm.
and say this thing happened to me or someone I know. But what are some of those big questions that you feel like your organisation is grappling with to combat rising rates of Islamophobia in Australia?
But that is the question that we're grappling with, Monique. The question that we're wanting to know, and conversations that I'm asking anyone that I speak to and meet and connect with on this issue is, why are you not reporting? And I ask that question. For me, that is the number one question that I need to know, because I need to understand that cynicism. And in the first 3 months of my role, I've traveled across, a couple states, and the Western states, in particular Western Australia and Adelaide, and made it, a point to go and have those conversations with them. And 100% of the people that I've met, and especially women, have had
Mm,
incidents of Islamophobia. And I've
yeah.
asked, have you reported it to anyone, whether it's the
Mm,
police, whether it's to your local mosque, or, not necessarily with the register? And the answer usually is no, I haven't reported it. And
mm,
then I ask why, because I need to understand why. Why is it that you don't want to report it? And part of it is that cynicism. What does it achieve?
yeah.
And that I can actually provide responses for. This is what it achieves, and this is what we've
Right.
done with the data. So I can actually provide that from an operational perspective. What I can't, and what I can't necessarily respond with a process or a procedure, is when I have Muslim women in particular tell me that this is, the lived experience of Islamophobia, or whether it's physical assault, or just name calling, or a hand gesture, or whatever it is, they honestly accept it as part of what it means to be a Muslim woman
Mhm.
here in Australia.
Yeah,
That's what worries me the most. That
absolutely.
is that what I'm the normalization of Islamophobia, and the fact that they think it's part and parcel of what it means to be a visible Muslim woman,
Mm,
visibly identifying Muslim women, that this is what I need to deal with. This is, it's I accept it. I accept that this is a test. I accept that
mhm,
this is what I need to go through. And therefore it's just chin up, and get on with life, because this is it's a normal part of what it means to be a Muslim. And this normalization of
mm.
Islamophobia, this normalization of racism and prejudice, discrimination, is what I am grappling with as executive director. How do I change this? And I'm worried about this because I see what's happening. I see what's happening internationally, what happens, when we normalize bad behavior such as this.
Absolutely. Even when we look psychologically, when we look at, particularly, this is worrying about what happens over the next couple of
Yeah,
generations because of
yeah,
everything that young people who are now in their 20s and 30s were exposed to in their late primary school,
yeah,
early adolescence. So, we're really talking about around that, probably post September 11. If you sort of were a child and growing up through that time,
yeah.
it's very highly likely that you experienced Islamophobia in primary school. I remember my daughter, was playing with a couple of our neighbors on the corner, and one of the brothers said to her, "Oh, no, I don't like you because you're a Muslim." And the other little
Oh,
boy, the other brother said, "What does that mean?"
mm,
And they were only like 8 and 9, at the time.
mm,
And then my daughter going, "What does that mean? What, like,
yeah,
why would they not like us?"
yeah, yeah,
Children are often very at times quite sheltered from the social political context, so they should be
yep,
as much as possible
yep,
and should just have a childhood.
yep,
But it's really interesting because what happens is if children, even within in the context of, say, family violence, have grown up in a space like that, and that
yep,
that type of abuse um, has become common and frequent,
yep,
that the child or the young person adapts and has to make sense of
yep,
that, right? And they can
yep,
adapt in probably one of three ways, and it's almost mirrors a fight, flight, freeze response of the body.
yep,
So they
yep,
can, the one, just surrender to it, Nora. So it's sort of like,
yeah,
if I surrender to it, then I just basically will go along with the idea that, well, we're a Muslim, we're a minority group, and
yep,
can't combat the stereotypes, or we can't
yep,
challenge the government with their perspectives,
yep,
etc. So
yep,
let's just surrender to it. And then in our surrendering, those coping strategies have to be internal. So
yeah.
people taking
That's right.
responsibility to go, well, I'm just going to have to cope with that. And so therefore there's this manifestation of ideas around that to go, this is what Muslims go through. You see that
Yeah,
idea? That's
yeah,
just an
yeah,
idea. It's not the truth situation.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
reaction and it's a coping strategy, but it's not a healthy adult one. Or you could
No.
just go into avoidance, Nora, where you just basically
Yeah.
avoid spaces. And we know so many people do that,
Yep.
particularly
Yep.
after specific events. They go into avoidance to protect themselves. Well, if I
Yep.
just avoid putting myself out there in spaces where I am a visibly Muslim, or loudly and proudly Muslim, or have an opinion that just happens to reflect Islam, then, like, as in, I won't do that. I will stay quiet and I will
Yep.
minimize those parts of my identity that are othered. Or
Yep.
I'll go into some overcompensation mode where I'll feel the need to go
Yeah.
so loud that it won't be acceptable in society anyway, that response,
Yeah.
the loud
Yeah.
response, the dramatic
Yeah.
response, okay?
Yeah.
As opposed
Yeah.
to just tuning in and going, actually, where are our healthy adult voices to deal with this? And
Mm.
that's actually why reporting is a healthy adult
Yeah.
response. It is neither surrender, avoidance, or overcompensation. It is healthy adult.
Yeah.
Advocacy, healthy adult.
Yeah.
So it's really
Yeah.
interesting for people to understand in where have they grown, as in the generation they've grown up in, and what response are we flicking into?
Mm.
And then for each of those unhealthy responses, we actually need strategies for.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is one thing. You're right. You're exactly right. In the sense that many people um perhaps say, look, it's that chin up. I don't want to be a victim. I don't want this to identify me, et cetera, et cetera. And what it's a process of awareness as well, and education that we need to do within community, that actually by reporting it, by doing something about it, your movement now is from a victim to actually being, an empowered, advocate, for yourself. So it's
Exactly.
regaining that sense of control. It's regaining that sense of agency that had been taken away from you as a result of this experience of Islamophobia. So it is about saying, actually, you're not, just becoming a victim of this. You're actually making a movement towards, agency, and control within what you decide to do about this. And we can support you, and we won't take away your agency. In fact, we will say, what is it? What support would you like? And it
Right.
doesn't have to be now. It can be 6 years later. We've had people coming to us who've had incidents of 6 years ago still say, it's still bothering me. Can I get, some mental health support? Actually, can I just have a conversation with somebody about this? And we're there to be able to provide that.
And I think people have to be, really cognizant that when people experience something immediately, we go into freeze mode, and that's quite an okay protective space to
Yeah.
be in. It can actually,
Mm,
if we were to, rise up in the moment, that could actually be a dangerous action for ourselves. So
mm,
sometimes going into
mm,
freeze in the moment where, it is totally protective. And you'll know you've gone into that if someone has said something to you, like you've experienced some
mm.
type of racist comment or Islamophobic comment in the street, and you've gone silent.
Yeah.
And it's not because you're stupid, because that's the thing that I hear a lot. Oh my God, I'm so
Yeah.
stupid. I should have said something. No, 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 no. No, this is your body and your brain taking over with a freeze response to keep you safe.
Mm,
And in doing that, and or, getting you prepared for fight or flight, it's got to redirect
mm.
energy away from your frontal cortex,
That's
which helps you to go
yeah.
into a really engaged conversation with someone to go, hey, I'm just wondering what's going on for you today. What's
Mm,
led you to say that to me? Like,
mm.
we're very
Yeah.
rarely going to be that measured in a
Yeah.
situation that provides us or puts us in a degree of shock. And what happens,
Yeah.
Nora, is people then go away, and if they don't do anything about it or they surrender to it, some more serious incidents, people just, it's too overwhelming. So we compartmentalize to
Mm,
survive. People have busy lives with
mm,
other stresses, and then they get
mm,
this on their afternoon on their way back from work.
mm,
We
mm,
compartmentalize
mm.
to survive. So when people come
Yeah.
back a year later, 6 years later, probably very much fits the definition of post-traumatic stress.
Okay.
It
Yeah.
lingers.
Yeah.
We survive when we're, like
Yeah.
when people are in a war, that's not where they're psychologically affected,
Yeah.
because they're mobilizing to stay alive. After
Yeah.
body decides you're in a safe space, the body will bring forward the trauma and say, here you go, have a look at it now because you're physically safe.
Yeah.
Now it's
Yeah.
time to have a look at the psychological stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we don't,
I
sort of,
couldn't, yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And just a very personal sharing. It took, so I'm a child of the Vietnam War. I was born just after the Vietnam War, but at the same time, my people are the indigenous people of Vietnam, the Cham people, and very much persecuted. And so after the Vietnam War, my dad had been what they call rehabilitated, which is just another word for torture, in some of those camps. And after that, we had to leave. Like my parents, my dad was no longer safe, and we had to leave in the middle of the night. Made our way through to Cambodia, and at that time, the Khmer Rouge was happening in Cambodia. And again, I was a child, not fully understanding it, and seeing it in movies and killing fields, etc. I've been to Cambodia to actually visit the killing fields and to actually see what had happened there. But every time I wanted to ask my parents about what happened, like, I remember snippets of it because I was only 3 at that time. I was born in 76 and we left Vietnam in 79. So I wanted to hear the stories, like, what are the stories? What was Vietnam? And they refused to tell, well, not refused, but just wouldn't go into it. And my dad tried a few times, and my mother would shut him down. No, we don't go there. We don't go there.
Mm,
And I remember my siblings and I were frustrated because we're like, we want to know more about you. You know, we want to know about your life. We want to know, and we just it was that period where they just both shut down, and it
mm,
was only probably about 6 years. Oh no, 2019. Yeah, probably 2019 where so we're talking about 5 years ago when I was in Cambodia with my mother, just visiting family, where she told me her story. 30 something years later, she finally said, "This is what I saw."
yeah,
These were, so what we're seeing played on the screens is what's happening in Palestine is what my mother is having to experience all over again. And this is what she said. She's like the what she's seeing, just bodies, just
mm,
everywhere, was what she saw walking through through Cambodia to get to Thailand as refugees, like just
yeah.
thousands of bodies and just seen everywhere. So yeah, this is what I'm, I guess, really concerned about, in the sense that we at the register, we're here for you however long that you need to access our services. Don't think that it was happened 7 years ago, that
Mm.
is, oh, it's outdated and therefore I can't come to you. You still can come to us as a register, and we want to be able to be the village that takes care of you, because I think sometimes that's really missing. So what is it that you need from us, and we'll do our utmost best to be able to provide that support for you.
And I think we've got to start to overcome an idea. I love how you
Yeah.
use the word "it takes a village," and it really does, because I think for
Mm,
a very long time within an Australian context as well, um, the community hasn't had a lot of solid infrastructure to lean on
mm,
for their well-being. It hasn't.
yeah.
It's within our generation. It is our generation that is setting up those
Mm,
organizations that have not been there before. And in
mm,
that, there can be a really over self-reliance. So self-reliance is, we all want to be autonomous and make our own decisions and have a really strong idea that we can cope on our own without the
mm,
assistance of other people. But this is, I think what's really important about the work of the register is around that when people report, it actually is furthering communal healing, not just communal advocacy, but communal healing. And perhaps this is a coping strategy that was definitely used in previous generations and certainly
mhm,
in other countries. But I think Australians have become, as in Australian Muslims, have become so self-reliant and
mm.
separate. But in that, there's the vulnerability of not leaning on each other for support.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
organisations
Yeah.
that are set up by the community for the community are to sort of go back to more traditional roots of being able to lean on the pillar of the community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfectly said. I'm actually writing, you can see me writing just gems that you said, Monique.
Don't
Thank you
worry,
so
Nora.
much for
I've
that.
already written down a few things you've said as well.
Okay,
So
okay.
a conversation to be
Yeah,
continued after this episode.
yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
Um, well, we haven't touched on other parts of the world. In the
Yeah.
past week in the UK, the UK has seen more than 50 separate anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant riots and ideologically inspired acts of violence committed against individuals, homes, and businesses following the spread of misinformation that the identity of the young man who committed horrendous acts of violence against multiple children, that his identity was Muslim, when in fact it was not. To quell the violence, the police actually, for the first time, released the name of the alleged perpetrator to prove to the general public that the offender was not Muslim, to get the rioters to back off.
Mm,
But since that time, there's been more than 400 people arrested, and more riots predicted for today and tomorrow. Not only have really many communities in the UK living in fear right now about their mobility, and it sounds very post September 11 again, but probably worse, because at that time there weren't riots in the UK on people's doorsteps. Um, Now, there's also not just fear that the community in the UK, the Muslim community in particular, and many other immigrant communities are experiencing, but this cynicism and contempt felt within Muslim communities towards, I'm going to use this term loosely, a project that's been in 50 years in the making in the UK that casts Muslims as the villain stereotype and reductive political narratives that continuously demonize Muslim communities. Where is this all heading? What are your thoughts? And are you worried about the same types of things occurring in an Australian
Yeah.
context?
We are, well, at the register, and then personally, we are deeply concerned with what's happening, and keeping a close eye on what's happening, because it goes back to my point about what happens when Islamophobia, specifically, and racism generally, is allowed to be normalized. This is what happens when this is normalized. It goes unchecked. So the political and media discourse, and you mentioned it, in earlier in the podcast, was what happens when there is irresponsible political and media discourse about Muslims, Islam, about immigration, about the other. And this is what we're seeing on the ground. So deeply, deeply concerning. The fact that, I think it was Al Jazeera did an analysis of, and I think they spoke to an associate professor at Qatar University there, who was looking at just the impressions on social media. And it's something like over 30 million, just in the first few hours of it, of just the announcement that there was a stabbing without any other identification. But there was something like nearly 30 million impressions on social media claiming and identifying him to be a Muslim. And they even had a
Wow.
name and everything. So 30 million within a few hours. So how do you expect the public then? To sort of decipher what is misinformation, disinformation, and accurate truth. And the fact that the judge had to do something that was quite unprecedented.
Yeah,
They don't reveal names of minors, but
exactly.
felt that this was the only way to be able to bring some sort of, I guess,
Yeah. Temper.
to tamper what's happening, to try to squash some of those riots. But you're right, the riots are still there. So this is then comes to play. Well, what's this really all about? The fact that
Yeah.
it's been announced that he's not Muslim, and yet you're still going and attacking mosques, you're still attacking Muslims, means that this is the justification that far right groups with hate ideology, with anti Muslim ideology, anti Islam ideology, anti immigration ideology. So the horrific stabbing incident had nothing to do with Muslims, Islam, or
Mm.
immigration. It had nothing to do with any of this. However, it is the anti-Islam, anti-Muslim, anti immigration rhetoric which has now really been exploited by far right groups to spread their fear and hate. This is exactly what they want. So even when you tell them it's not a Muslim,
Yeah.
they don't care. They just need a justification to spread, chaos, to spread the fear and the hate. So you can't help but be cynical about it, going, well,
Mm.
actually, there are no Muslims there. Why? Well, it's because, again, the racism and Islamophobia has become normalized. That this is this was what was perhaps excused or justified in order to commit these acts of violence and the riots that we're seeing in the UK. We're very concerned about this. We're
Mm.
very concerned because we think that we're, at the sort of the bottom of the world, depending on where you look at, we're at the
Yeah.
bottom of the world, we're down under, we're far removed from it, but we're not, because we are seeing the same rhetoric, political rhetoric,
Mm.
that is sometimes encouraged or at least amplified within the media with certain, and not just social media. We're talking about our, normal mainstream media as well. So if we're seeing these things amplified, just and especially with everything that's happening in Gaza, we know the online hate.
Yeah.
We definitely have seen the online hate, especially like on X, on Twitter. Every time there has been a media report that is, on X, and you just scroll down, and the comments, that are anti-Islam, or anti-Muslim, is awful, is absolutely awful. And again, it's just left there. It's left there, and it's
Mm.
becoming unchecked and normalized. I know I use the word normalize a lot because this is what's happening.
Yeah,
And if
that's right.
left unchecked, that's what's happening in the UK, and we don't want the same thing here. So if we're serious about social cohesion, if we're serious about, social inclusion, and, the government uses these two terms a lot,
Yeah.
then we need to ensure that we have responsible political leadership so that we are talking about bringing people together rather than dividing people and compartmentalizing them in this us and them dichotomy is what's happening in the UK. We don't want that here. And what it means then for us as a registers, that I'm bracing myself. I'm bracing myself because I know that the impact of it on especially visibly identifiable Muslim women.
Yeah.
I've had women already tell me that exactly what you said is that almost intentional coping, to make sure that they feel safe. So they are nervous about going, about
Mm.
their everyday activities like
Yeah.
shopping or picking up the kids from school, just in case they have to cop it. You know, that sense of vulnerability, that then perceived exclusion. So they might not go somewhere because they're going to be excluded, or perhaps they'll get assaulted. So it is that intentional security
Mm.
and based on perceived discrimination or perceived assault or perceived exclusion. So Muslims are having to take into their own hands to say, what is it that's going to make me feel safe today? It might
Mm.
mean that I'm not leaving the house today because, or I'm not taking public transport, or I'm not going to a shopping center because, unfortunately, public transport and public places are the number one, the context in which Islamophobia happens. It doesn't really happen in a private place. It's actually happening in a very public space. So
In very
where
public
people
space.
should, yeah, where people should feel safe, and
Safe.
especially Muslim women. So very,
Absolutely.
very concerning. Yeah, we're deeply very concerning and monitoring the situation so that we're prepared. So we're bracing ourselves for what could happen
Mm.
here,
Absolutely.
unfortunately.
And it really goes back to, this idea also um, of reporting and speaking up about it,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
not only are you combating and to be realistic, to think that we're going to combat all the hate online when people are very loose with their keyboards,
yeah,
and you could say 90% of people would never say something out loud and in public, but
yeah.
there's a lot of keyboard warriors out there who are just very loose,
Mm,
with what they write online because they're hiding behind the screen. So that's one.
yeah.
But it is important to stand up and raise your voice, not just surrendering to an idea that this is an ongoing thing and we just have to put up with it, and finding
Mm,
other ways too to use your voice by talking within, speaking up within your organizations that you work for, or to your local councillors in your
mm,
municipalities about what you're worried about, and or to your local MPs, and holding them to account to be more responsible in their governing. It's been decades worth of quite Islamophobic policies against Muslims, and policies they would never fly if they were applied to the mainstream. And you can see that Australia culturally is not that different to the UK culturally, even in
yeah,
terms of being multicultural countries. But
yeah.
culturally, we're not that different. So to think that something is not going to play out in Australia because we're different is ludicrous, because they're
Mm,
using the exact same similar policies and playbook that they did in the UK. So
yeah,
it's like, you created this, and you use
yeah.
irresponsible. I go further and say negligent, Nora. It's
Mm,
negligent,
mm, mm, mm,
absolutely negligent, that they're putting
mm.
Muslim community members and other minority groups who might have some Muslim
Yeah,
misattribute in
yeah,
harm's way, and then
yeah,
thinking
yeah,
that we are just going to surrender to that idea.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah,
racism
yeah.
and
It's
Islamophobia are both forms of power over that one group uses over another to maintain privilege and inauthentically build identity security against a backdrop of othering. So if I'm not sure about me and who I am and what my identity represents, like my ethnic or national identity, but another group does, that makes me feel uncomfortable. So let me do something about that. Okay. It's a driver of having power over, but it's inauthentic. Okay. Dismantling any form of power over requires clear and concise labelling of the behaviours that make up racism and Islamophobia. So essentially making the invisible visible. Okay. One of the most important functions of Islamophobia Register is naming and recording incidents of racism and Islamophobia. I'm just wondering, what are there do you think that there's anything that we're seeing now that we didn't necessarily see 10 and 20 years ago in terms of specific types of behaviours perpetrated against Muslims in Australia?
Yeah. So I'll go back to the first question and then sort of segue into to the second half of the question. But in terms of naming it, and this is why the register exists in order to be able, and I talk about it a lot in my role as executive director, is that um, we we can't talk about community, or strong community. We can't talk about harmony. A strong government loves Harmony and Harmony Day. Um, or now Harmony Week, there's a Harmony Week associated with it. We can't talk about these glowing concepts and that we want and aspire for Australia to build an inclusive, socially cohesive, socially, social inclusion. So all these beautiful, beautiful buzz terms that we do want and aspire for Australia
Mm,
to be. We can't reach that if we don't understand what the problem is. If we
mm,
don't understand why somebody feels excluded, we can't get to inclusion unless we name this is why somebody feels excluded. And for many Muslims, Islamophobia is one of the reasons why they feel excluded.
mm.
They feel prejudiced against. They feel that they're not going to get the job, and it's we know that research shows that having an Arab or Muslim name is gonna means that less chance of your application even going through the interview. Forget getting to the interview, it's just not even going to have somebody look at it going, actually, yep, we might interview that person. So you can't even get to that short list. So these are real experiences of Muslims in terms of Muslims feeling and other racialized communities feeling excluded. So we need to be able to understand this before we get to social cohesion, so and social inclusion. So what registering and reporting an incident to us helps us understand is, first of all, the context in which this is happening. We can say at this point in time there was perhaps political rhetoric that was about Muslims and Islam, and so therefore the next week we've seen a rise in Islamophobia. For instance, when Peter Dutton made that comment about the Muslim political parties, we saw a rise in online hate against Muslims, for instance. So that was sort of captured. So then we can say, well, there you go. This is what happens when irresponsible or negligent, as you rightfully pointed, Monique, negligent,
Mhm.
rhetoric comes out of one of our elected, political leaders. So we can actually advocate to have more responsible, leadership,
That's right.
for instance. So this is why, and for us to be able to advocate, we need to know these stories. We need to know your experiences. We need to not just support you, but to advocate for a society that we all aspire to do. Because yes, we are Muslim, but in the end, we're all Australians as well. And so we also have a part to play. So this is where I think for me, the point of reporting is actually to demand your right as Australians, to be able to walk the street and feel completely safe, regardless of what you wear, regardless of what skin color you are, regardless of what you look like. You, as an Australian, have every right to be able to wear what you like to wear, to profess your faith, to wear a pin, or to wear a
Mm,
kafia, or to wear a thobe or an abaya or hijab or not a hijab, whatever it is that you would like to, however you'd like to identify yourself, you have every right to do that. And as an Australian, this is what we should aspire as Australians to do, to create spaces where we feel safe, in each other's, surroundings. We
That's
feel
right.
safe in our relationship with one another. Like I felt safe with my neighbors. I always go back to that because
Mm,
they gave me really they gave me an inkling of what it is like to have a socially inclusive, socially cohesive society that the political rhetoric. So there's no point throwing billions of dollars into social cohesion if what you say isn't matching what you're doing on the ground. And this is all we're
mm,
asking our political leadership to do, is that you're throwing money in social cohesion, but you've got to be able to match it. Like, help us make our work easier. We want to help you make your work easier, help us make our work easier in order to build
mm,
strong communities that we all want for ourselves, for our children. I'm a grandparent. I want this for my grandchildren as well,
mm,
and my grandchildren are sixth generation Australian. And yet, because they're Muslim, they'll always have a little bit about them that perhaps will not make them feel completely, included. Just and yet they're six generation Australian, Monique.
yeah,
Like, how
yeah,
many more generations do they need to be to feel Australian? But because of perhaps their skin color or the fact that they're Muslim, will always mean that perhaps just in some communities or some groups, that they will always feel excluded. And this is what is troubling me. And this is
absolutely.
why I do the work that I do, so that we can at least chip at this, to really aspire to the Australia that we want to live. We're better than this. I know we're better than this. My neighbors, on September 11th, and just after that, gave me an inkling and gave me a model of what it means to really be intentional in um, wanting a society that is inclusive of all.
In fact, what I think your neighbors actually gave you, and you are very much part of that, that
Yeah.
tribe as such,
Yeah. Yes.
is actual leadership. It's
Yeah.
intentional leadership about how you wanted your little community, your little neighborhood to operate. And I think what we're
Mm,
what we're referencing is people in leadership roles, but it's not actually leadership. It's just loud and it's lazy. It's lazy. Okay. Pain is a huge attention seeker, and division is painful. Exclusion is painful. Okay. And so it's a very easy part of the playbook to use to instill fear in people or inflict pain in people and create a sense of, like that. This is why you need us in power so that we can reduce your pain. But at the same time, we're increasing it.
yeah.
And so I think this idea of,
Yeah.
where we actually, if we could take it back right to the beginning of our discussion, as in drop the fences, invest significantly in initiatives, where people, build bridges and connect,
Mm,
rather than
mm,
using, I think I've sort of, that question I asked you about what's changed. There is um, I think it's like this emerging fluency, or I don't know what the word is. There's this emerging. It's quite distressing to see, but just this flippancy in the language, I think, of people in leadership roles
mm,
to utilize creating pain through division to stay
mm,
in power.
mm, mm,
And that's not leadership. And like you
mm.
said, we Australians are way better than this.
We are.
Quite frankly, un-Australian to act in this way.
Mm, mm, mm.
Yeah.
I agree.
Nora, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Oh, my dream. I'll talk about my dream. My dream is to not have a job in this space in, say, 10 years' time. So if I can give you my 10-year, vision and mission for the organization, where, 10 years, next month we'll be, reflecting rather than celebrating. I don't know if you can celebrate this type of work, reflecting
Yeah.
on this work and how far we've come. But my dream for myself and this organization is that I won't be working within this space. In fact, I would be working for Yara. It's that's another word about women's wellness, and this is about bringing our cultural wisdoms to really the well-being of women. And so that's really something that is I'm hoping that we won't have this issue. But the reality is, until we can connect exactly what we said from the top to what's happening on the ground, there's
Mm,
always going to be this disconnect. It's always going to be disconnect. And I think that's the problem with politics, isn't it?
mm,
It's a business. It needs to excite, it needs to shock, it needs to make money, it needs to, yeah.
mm.
So but that would be, yeah, last words. My dream in 10 years is that we don't need an Islamophobia register. We don't need people working in this space to talk about anti-racism and to talk about, and to remind people to just be better,
Mm,
to be good, to lead with compassion. I think that's probably what it boils down to, is to lead with compassion. And compassion means that I don't want for you what I wouldn't want for myself. So it's not just empathy itself. It's not just walking in somebody's shoes, but actually saying, I don't want that for you because I wouldn't want that for myself, and relating at a very, instead of you and I, but in the togetherness of a we. So yeah, so hoping that our political leadership, with everything they do, that everything should be embedded in compassion. I think that's really a concept and value that is lacking in the world, and especially in political leadership.
And I have nothing more to add on that. That's a beautiful way to
Thank
finish
you.
our episode. Thank you, Dr. Nora Amath, for joining us in this latest episode of Be Well. I think
Thank you,
compassionate
Monique.
leadership would be a lovely next episode to be talking about at some point. Let's come back and talk
Oh, I
about
can
that.
talk about that. I can talk about that
Ah,
for
of course you can. Of
for
course. Of course. I
us.
think you're an
Yeah.
exemplar of that actually
Yeah.
yourself, Nora, and
Thank
I'm really
you.
glad that you're
Thank
in this
you.
position. So again, thank you to the Register for for being part of our program again. So that's it for this episode. It's been really interesting talking around the increasing challenges that Muslims are experiencing in space of the world, and also in the experience and ongoing challenge when it comes to dealing with Islamophobia. So take care and see you again soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.